Hello, my name is Quintessence, and I'm here to talk to you today about sensory-friendly monitoring, which is about alert fatigue. Just as a quick heads up, you might want to mute your Echo devices or Google Home devices in listening range or use headphones. I'm not actually going to troll you, but you might encounter a talk that unintentionally does, so that's always a good practice to have. And going right into things, when we try to know everything, we get something that looks a little like this. In the beginning, it has good intentions, right? You might have a status page, you might have something connected to a notification app of no particular name whatsoever, and so forth. But then things start to expand outward. You want to be updated when a Confluence page you're following is updated. You want to know when tickets are moving and such. And then all of a sudden, you're just getting hit with all this noise and no actual information. And as a result, important high-severity alerts are going to be buried in a sea of low-priority notifications. What ends up happening then is people will start to mute those individual notifications or the sources. Think about those times you close Slack or whatever to focus. Unfortunately, then the result is the notifications don't go through at all, which on some level is the point, but not entirely the point. And when you turn the dial that far back, you get suspicious Squidward. You've made silence, but you know it's manufactured silence. It's not silence because everything's green and everything's in the okay state. It's silent because you've closed things so they can't bother you. So let's find a happy medium. First things first, the cost of noise. Every alert is a distraction that the brain needs to filter. And I just want to think about osmotic learning for a moment. And I fumbled that greatly, but we're going to keep going with it. So osmosis, right? If you've ever cohabitated with any other human, roommates, siblings, parents, guardians, spouses, whatever, you've likely been deluged by their interests and they've been deluged by yours. So you might suddenly find yourself knowledgeable on things like dogs, nutrition, or what have you, despite never actually listening to a podcast on your own or cracking a book on your own, right? Even if you're not actively focusing on them and their activities, them being in your space is stuff that you're actively learning, even if you're filtering it out so that you can focus on whatever you're trying to focus on. And within the context of tasks, it takes about 25 minutes to reset on a task. And this is a study that was done by Gloria Mark at UC Irvine. And so the idea here is not I redirected and started doing a new task and then got back to my original task. This 25 minutes is for simple interruptions that do not require you to fully change your focus. Think of Joe the developer walking up to you and asking you for a Wi-Fi password, that sort of thing. You were modeling something, you were building something, you were writing an essay or whatever you're doing, and where you were in space puffs and you answer their question. And then in order to start getting back to where you were, you have to kind of rewind in your brain and get to where you are and continue where you were when they asked you the question. There's also a quality cost associated with frequent interruptions. So this was done actually with AP test scores, and for those unfamiliar, AP tests are graded on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 being the highest. And so what they did is they wanted to see how these scores fared if they had interruptions during the test. And what they noticed is that their scores dropped by 0.5 point, which is well significant on that scale. And the 96% of those, when they got interrupted, those are the ones that did the worst. And this study was done by George Mason University. And one more study before we continue, Michigan State. So they took the prior studies and decided to iterate and see what would happen. So what they did is they had 300 people perform a sequence-based task. So think of it as like Bart Simpson writing lines on a chalkboard. So the task itself was not complicated. It wasn't an essay, it wasn't a Kubernetes cluster, it was lines on a chalkboard. And they wanted to see what would happen. The error rate tripled. So that's what happens, right? So we have these studies that are following people around, and they also noticed for when George Mason circled back around on that prior study with the AP test, when they gave them the time back, the scores did not rebound. So all of this goes to say that minor interruptions can actually have significant costs. So reducing the noise is actually a very important problem because you do not want to be interrupted unless you should be interrupted. And the first thing that you want to keep in mind is that you want to be aware. You also want to determine noise sources, categorize the types, and then channel all that information into a productive flow. You'll also want to create a routine to clear the clutter, because it's entirely possible that when you get started, there's going to be a lot of extraneous noise. And so when you're looking at different types of noise, you're looking at their sources, you want to start and see if there's patterns to them or anything that you can do to get additional information out of what you're seeing. And even when you're looking at a relatively simple infrastructure, and let's give you an example. Relatively simple infrastructure. This I made a little bit ago. You can see relatively outdated Slack logo hanging out there. But regardless, it's still applicable, right? You have a chat, you have an email client, you have a notification service, you have something for ticketing, you have something for logging, you have infrastructure, and you have your code base living somewhere. And all these things are chattering with each other. But you also see on the right side there that I have a little human. And that is because humans interrupt ourselves all the time, especially in the pandemic, especially if you're not living alone in the pandemic. And I say that kind of with a broad scope because I technically live alone in the pandemic, but I have a cat, right? So we interrupt ourselves all the time. And so how often are you checking your email, your social, your text, other messages, and so forth, especially if, as mentioned, you're not living with other people and you maybe haven't had the socialization that you're accustomed to. You're not seeing people in an office if that was the way you were working. You're not seeing friends after work if that's the way you were working, right? And you're trying to bridge these gaps. It's a lot of distraction. How many of you are doing other tasks while listening to this talk? No judgment. We all do it. We're working from home now, even if we were not prior, right? But these are all distractions. And in the beginning, I mentioned about muting Echo devices or Google Home devices. And the reason for that is I actually sat in a talk where someone used the name Alexa as an example. And, you know, it had the anticipated effect. It wasn't on purpose. The other speaker was actually named that. But again, it just goes to the point of if you have something kind of in a speaker in a larger room, you want to make sure that the speaker can't inadvertently communicate with devices in your home. Going back to intentional home space, communication and boundaries. You want to set times to focus on work and mute those non-critical alerts. And this includes messages from friends and family, especially important right now when we might all be living with aforementioned friends and family or not, and they're just as lonely and stranded as we are. You also want to define what a relevant emergency is and set reasonable expectations for yourself and for others. And to recap all of those. And so when you're setting time for focus work, especially with like work calendars, it's important to indicate on that calendar or in the family calendar or on the friend calendar or whatever you're doing, what those blocks are so people know when they shouldn't try and talk to you because they're not going to know otherwise, right? And you need to define what a relevant emergency is because you don't want people to not contact you when they should for some reason, right? And you need to be reasonable about what ends up happening with those comms because as hard as it is for you to follow your own schedule, let alone your siblings, your parents, your guardians, your whomever, you need to make sure that you give them as much grace as you kind of want for yourself, right? And going back to IT and these external sources of noise, we need to think of some things that we can do to take action on pop-ups like those. So in terms of categorization, which I talked about a little bit, and I'll recap these in a few slides, false positives, false negatives, fragile systems, and frequent patterns of notifications are really the top ones that you're looking at. So the first two, false positives and negatives, means that things are firing off when they shouldn't be or aren't firing off when they should be. And in both cases, they're causing confusion for you. Fragile systems and frequent systems usually go hand in hand. The idea is you have something that's flapping. And so it might be sending a notification. That notification might make sense. It doesn't matter if it makes sense if you don't need that notification. And what do I mean by that? If you know the surface is going to be flapping and you can perhaps automate around that behavior, does it make sense for it to notify you when it can just do that step or run that script or do whatever it needs to do to resolve itself? Or if you're getting a notification where you've set something to tell you if it's fall below a certain usage or whatever, but there's no actionable from you, so now you're getting a notification, but there's nothing you need to do. You might need to record that information, but you don't need to be interrupted about it. And so these are all things that you're thinking about when you start to categorize your noise. And then you need to create a flow. So when we're looking at the actionable alerts, you need to know what needs to be known, who needs to know it, how soon they should know, and how they should be notified. And the idea here is you don't want to be paged when something's not important enough to warrant a page. And you also want to make sure that you're putting enough information in that alert that someone knows what to do. It doesn't need to be a novel. In fact, very explicitly, you probably don't want it to be a novel. You want to communicate what needs to be known. And if there's a relevant, like doc, if something in the run book is like, hey, this is a frequently, this incident is frequent. Here's some documentation. Here's a script to run. Like, put it right in the alert. Why not? It can only speed up the resolution process, but you want to make sure you're not writing a whole bunch of information that's not human understandable in the alert, in the body of the notification. You also want to make sure they're routing correctly. So let's say I work on back end and I get a front end notification. One, what do I do with that? Right. So the first thing I probably do with that is think to myself, oh, this needs to go to the front end team. Oh, but who on the front end team? So if it's happening in the middle of the night, I get a page, the 4 a.m. page. Who do I contact at 4 a.m. on the front end team? Do I know? Is it documented somewhere? Do I have something hopefully nicely configured in whatever notification app where I can just page front ends on call and it goes to the right person? And I don't need to know who that person is, right? How easy is this for me to do, right? When you start evaluating your notifications, you'll probably notice a lot of misrouting. And that's okay. When you start doing some of the cleanup, what you can do is start routing those things correctly or changing their thresholds so that they make sense. So if I say, okay, I've been woken up by this alert, so as part of the postmortem, the action items for this is to route the alerts to the front end team, right? You also want to take a look at how soon they should know and how they should be notified. So the how soon goes to, do I need to know now? Is this a next business day thing? And the how is this an email or is this a page type of, for the extrema? You want to have these things documented and codified because you don't want people to personally know if they're emailing or paging someone. If I am using, for example, a notification app and I need to reroute that page to the front end team or whatever, I don't need to keep track of front end team gets emailed this way, and then SRE team gets contacted this way, and everybody has a different preference. If you can configure it in the app and then I use the app to take advantage of that, I just need to know who to send it out to, and the app says high, low priority or whatever, and it takes care of it, and that team puts their preferences in there. In lieu of that, you want to make sure that you have things documented in a common place, separate Confluence pages or whatever makes sense, so that everyone's using basically the same framework for everything. It's also important when you're setting all this up to have just enough redundancy to help yourself, right? So one of the things I like to pick on a little bit here is Slack, because they're overall a really good tool, right? We all came back to work in the beginning of the year. Slack had an outage, and a typically long one. They don't normally go down like that. But if I was reliant on them as my sole source for notifications for whatever reason, I had everything integrated into Slack, I'm a startup, whatever, and I was relying on Slack to send me notifications about my outage, their outage could become my outage in the sense that I now have a vacuum. If I can't flip endpoints on the fly, that vacuum stays. So you want to have just enough redundancy in your tooling so that if something happens with one of your dependent services, you can adjust and handle. And you also want to be able to switch if it happens that a service that used to be reliable is no longer so. So I mentioned Slack is really reliable. And as long as Slack keeps being reliable, great, right? No changes, no action needed. You just need to be able to handle it in the event that they have an atypical outage. But if you're using a different service or a homegrown service or whatever, and you're noticing that it's not keeping in alignment with your SLAs, you need to be able to take action on when you notice that instead of being locked into a situation that you can't fix or can't easily fix. And all of this goes to say that resilient noise builds trust. So if you don't have resilient noise, going back to what I've mentioned a few times now, silence isn't true. There might be silence because my tool is having an outage, so anything that relies on that tool is having an outage, or not having an outage, I just don't know. Or I'm closing things, like I'm closing Slack while I'm trying to do focus work or whatever, and it's not really quiet, I've just made it quiet. Now, I might also hand off to other people and say, hey, I'm closing Slack for a while, I need you to keep an eye on it, or whatever your working arrangements are, but that makes resilient noise. Now you have other communication mechanisms happening to compensate for silence that's being created. Going back to the tools again, how reliable are they, and are you evaluating them every so often just to make sure that everything is staying the way you need it to? And how much duplication is needed. So you don't want to be in a situation where when a notification is sent out and a separate notification is sent out, they actually end up being the same underlying issue. It's just generating a lot of noise over what really is one common cause. It's just that the thresholds or the definitions are such that it looks like different things. So two teams may be getting two separate notifications based on expertise, but they're not working together yet because they don't know that they need to be. And can you switch those endpoints in the event of a service outage, relevant to the example that I gave already, right? You need to be able to switch in the event that somebody else's tool goes down if you have a dependent tool. And you want to make sure that you're regularly reevaluating. And I'm just going to put the summary slide up. So you want to make sure you're regularly reevaluating the reliability of your services. Make sure you're staying in your SLAs. Make sure their SLAs are still matching your SLAs and that everything's in a nice copacetic space that way. And one last thing before we head out for the day, keeping alerts relevant. Sprint cleaning is the nickname I give this, but basically you want to take every alert triggered and then ask questions about it, notably after the incident, right? Was the notification needed? Was it resolved? Was it automated? And was that solution permanent? And how was that urgently was that solution needed? So the idea here is, if the notification wasn't needed, so let's say I got woken up because of an underutilization, but there's no impact there, then maybe that notification wasn't needed. Maybe it needed to be logged somewhere, and it is, but I didn't need to be notified. How was that incident resolved? So let's say that you're getting notified about a service that got replaced. So do you want to leave all of the ties to that service that's now no longer being used on all the thresholds or whatever else you have configured active? No, right? You want to go through and clean those things up because you don't want unpredictable behavior to happen because you're receiving notifications around things that don't actually exist anymore. With regards to automation, sometimes you can notice precursor behavior. So let's say that you have a certain type of incident that happens often enough that you notice that certain behavior or behaviors happen in advance of it. And if you start automating around those things, knowing that if you need to run a script at a certain time or in response to a certain behavior, you can prevent the incident from occurring by doing this other thing. If the solution's permanent, that means you've done something to permanently change the conditions so that particular situation should no longer arise. Now, don't just go deleting things. I mean, deleting things is really cathartic, but don't delete things unnecessarily. Even if the solution is permanent, make sure that it ties into that notification in some way. You might still need it for other reasons. And you also want to make sure that it was sent out with the right urgency. If something woke you up when it really should have just been logged to Slack to be checked the next business day or whatever, like you don't want to keep those hanging around because you don't want people woken up for inactionable things or things that they shouldn't be working on until normal business hours. So that is to say, you want to make sure that you're keeping those alert cleans. And once you do your initial cleanup, which might take a while if you schedule some time for it, afterwards, the reason I nicknamed it, sprint cleaning, if you do it on a regular cadence, or if you do it every time something's triggered as part of your post-mortem process, you're more likely to keep the changes you're making very small and iterative and keeping them in pace with whatever changes you're making to your environment, rather than needing to do like the annual spring cleaning, but with notifications, which is not ideal and not great. And so with that said, I have all of the slides with some additional resources, including links to the studies that I mentioned, available on my notice page, which is linked on the slide. And with that, I hope you have a great DevOps Days. Again, my name is Quintessence, and I'm a developer advocate here at PagerDuty. If you have any questions, I'll be hanging out in the event chat. I hope you have a great day.